My name's Chris Ryan. I work with The Ringer, but it's my honor to welcome the creative team behind one of my favorite shows of all time, Justified. We'll start with Graham Yost, the creator, showrunner, executive producer, and writer. Michael Dinner, the director, executive producer. Taylor Elmore, writer, producer. Dave Andron, writer, producer. Chris Provenzano, writer, producer. Benjamin Cavell, writer, producer. Ingrid Escajeda, writer, producer. DJ Boyd, writer, producer. Wendy Calhoun, writer, producer. These are the people who made Justified. How about that? Everybody, thank you so much. It was just a pleasure to see you all interact and get this class reunion going. Graham, it must be special for you to see everybody under one roof again.
Yeah, it is. There is, you might have heard, there's a new chunk of Justified that's being shot right now in Chicago. And Michael Dinner and Dave Andron are the showrunners on that. And there was a room started back a year ago, March or so. So some of these faces I would see on the Zoom. I was allowed, I'm in a new deal, I'm not really involved with the show that much unless it's really successful, in which case I'll say you're welcome. You know, it's a different thing. You see people on Zoom all the time and then see them in person. It's like, oh my God, that really is like the old days. It's been really pretty cool getting together.
Yeah, Wendy, you were just saying to me outside that not all writers' rooms are also families like this, and that it's kind of cool to be in the same room together again.
It is. It's beautiful to see everyone, and we've been talking a little bit about our families, so it kind of feels like they've grown up together, even though, you know, I haven't seen some people here in over a decade, although others I've seen almost weekly. But it's really wonderful to have that spirit, and having been in a lot of rooms myself, I can honestly say this one's very special.
You know, I have to say that over the last couple of days, I'm not re-familiarized, but I was going to watch a couple of classic episodes, and then I just started the pilot, and then I just lost 3 days of work as I just let Justified play in the background. How often do you guys revisit the show? I'm curious whether or not it's like, I wrote it, it's done, it's out. Or do you ever go back, do you ever catch it on TV or catch it coming up on Hulu and you just sort of let it play at all?
I will say that my wife had not seen it. And so in the last year and a half, because she was going to sit down and watch it, I sat down with her, right? And kind of in the same way that you did, was like, well, I'll watch here and there, and I'll do other stuff. And I found myself sitting there watching it. Part of that is it's great to be getting older and not have such a great memory, and there was so much that I'd forgotten. A few episodes I don't know if I'd even ever seen, frankly. But it was fun to kind of to go back into it, and the timing was obviously good doing this another round of it. And it holds up okay. You know, there's some things you wish had been better, but a lot of it is pretty entertaining, and you can be proud of it.
Great, sorry, go ahead.
When we started the writers' room for this 8-episode limited series, we were joined by Walter Mosley, who joined us in the writers' room, and he was like the crypt keeper. He remembered more than we. He said, "Remember in that episode in the 3rd season, the 4th episode, when blah 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 blah." And Dave and I would look at each other and go, "I don't know."
Well, Walter had been in the Snowfall room since the start, and he had talked for 4.5 years about how much he loved the show. And I thought he was bullshitting, but he wasn't. He really does. And so it was fun to get him to come in and play on this. 4 times? Yeah, he said he'd seen it 4 times.
Wow. Graham, let's go back to the beginning. As you're putting together the writer's room that's going to work on this show, what was the quality you were looking for in the writer? Was a familiarity with Leonard important? Was it necessary? Was it sometimes not an advantage to have that?
I think a familiarity with Leonard, Elmore Leonard, was helpful, but it was really, can someone be, there's a term we used to use, we're going to swear a little bit today, okay?
Yeah.
We might say gosh and darn and fuck. Anyway, one of our go-to things in Justified was it needs to be fucked up and funny. And so I was always looking for that. And when I wrote the pilot, I based it almost entirely on the short story, the novella, Fire in the Hole. And I remember Elmore saying, "Oh, I really liked it." And I said, "Of course you did, Elmore. That's your story." I mean, it was like, I would be sitting there going, what's Raylan going to say next? Well, what did Elmore have him say next? Let's go with that. But then it was like, who's going to write on it? And the first call was to Fred Golan, who couldn't make this event today. Fred and I worked together back since Boomtown, and we also worked together on a show, a short-lived show on NBC called Reigns, starring Jeff Goldblum. And so the next call was to people who worked on Reigns. And Dave Andron, you were on Past Life at the time?
We don't have to talk about that.
Dave couldn't come over on staff, but he did 2 freelance that season. Taylor Elmore was on Cold Case and couldn't join the staff or even do a freelance. We got him in the 2nd season. And Wendy Calhoun was from the days on Reigns. And when Reigns got canceled, I think yours was like going to be the next to go or something. No, it was Jennifer Cecil's, but yours was the right after that. So I knew Wendy was funny, and I knew that Taylor and Dave could do that odd sort of Elmore Leonard humor, and Fred. And then it was looking for other writers, and the whole thing started when Carl Beverly, Sarah Timmerman's partner, read the short story in a collection, said to Sony, "We should do this," and they got Michael to sign on as a director. And then they were looking for a writer, and I came on board with that. But one of the writers that Carl and Sarah had found was this guy who had been a novelist and had written a script about the first murder squad in Boston back in 1850 or something like that. This guy named Ben Cavell. And I was like, wow, this is really good writing. Let's bring him on board. And then we didn't get Ingrid until season 3. And Ingrid had, I think had read, Fred and I were looking for other writers, and Ingrid had written a script called Left of Boom about a bomb squad. And it had that same kind of thing, which is it's law enforcement, but it's kind of fucked up, and it's funny. And so that was always our thing for Elmore. And I will say one thing about the new iteration, the scripts I've read, and is that the same ethos applies, which is, would Elmore like this? And he would love it. So that was always our goal. And for the whole series, I would say the best review we ever got was that Elmore Leonard liked the show.
Yeah. For the folks that sort of started to come in season 2, season 3, you're writing as much for these what are becoming iconic characters. You know, you have a familiarity with Justified at this point. Ingrid, you're coming in season 3, so they just finished the Margot Martindale season. What was that like, kind of walking into a room where like it's all kind of going in one direction already? You must have been a fan of the show by that point, yeah.
I was a huge fan of the show. I had also, Justified was my first drama. I started off in comedy, and it had taken about 2 years to make the switch. So I was in the headspace of, fuck it, if this doesn't work, I'm gonna go be a therapist or live in London. So I brought that attitude into the room, and feeling like I sort of had nothing to lose, I think benefited me greatly. Because I was like, well, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And it did. And I mean, to me, I felt very quickly that this was a great fit. Like it was the same. I now constantly maintain that when I'm looking for new projects, that my mantra is fucked up and funny. And that's what came off of this. And it's just sort of, it's in my DNA now, and any projects without that, I don't gravitate to, I've got to say. This gets in your blood.
For the writers here, what was your relationship to Elmore Leonard? Like, VJ, I'll start with you. I mean, were you somebody who had sort of...
Oh, just a second.
Yeah.
I didn't tell the VJ story.
Oh, tell the VJ story.
Oh my God, the VJ story. VJ was our PA on the first season, and we like to say that we made him a writer because he was a terrible PA. And to which VJ says, I wasn't that bad, I was good, you got the lunches on time, shut up. And then in the second season, FX had a diversity hire thing, and so we put VJ in that slot. We'd read some of his stuff and thought it was good. And he just sat and listened. And he read a lot of the Elmore stuff, and just waited. And by season 3, getting him a script or co-written by, and then by the end of the show, VJ was really one of the senior writers as we sort of looked at this core team, a lot of these people here. And that was, anyway, I'm sorry, I built it up, but that's the VJ story.
I knew what joke you were going for there, but like I had honestly never read Elmore Leonard until I was an assistant on the show. But this is how I learned to write TV. Is I learned from these guys, and honestly, they've been a huge help to me going forward. You know, as I've been running shows and such. Also, like I still call Dave for advice and such, and so all these people were kind of mentors to me. So like it was, I think in a way it was, even though I hadn't read Elmore, it was sort of an easy transition into it because I hadn't written anything for TV at all anyway. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna read all this Elmore Leonard stuff and I'm gonna write it like that. And you know, I think that I'm pretty good at that sort of fan fiction type of a thing, where it's already an existing thing and I can write in that style. And I think that that's helped me in other jobs also, so.
Ben, were you somebody who, did you feel intimidated at all going on to a show where you were going to be writing an adaptation of The Greatest Crime Writer maybe ever?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I knew enough to feel intimidated because Justified was my first experience of television, and I frankly, I mean, except for the pilot that Graham mentioned, the first script for television I wrote, Graham said, "Hey, this is great, go produce it now." So it essentially functioned as my film school, and I intimidated. I had loved Elmore forever, so that part of things I actually felt like I had a pretty good handle. I mean, imitating Elmore Leonard, I suppose you never assume you'll be able to do, but knowing Elmore Leonard and sort of knowing his oeuvre, that I was comfortable with. But I don't know. I also, I must say, I didn't appreciate how amazing the Justified writer's room was until I left it. It was my first experience of a writer's room, and I was there from the beginning and stayed to the end. And I've been on a number of shows since, and some very well-regarded ones, but nothing has ever sort of replicated the feeling of all of us. Not just because we love each other so much, but also because we really we respect each other, but we also have a sort of a creative symbiosis that is I don't know, that maybe Graham knew he was putting together, but that I find just an alchemy that is incredibly hard to replicate.
Graham, it's kind of funny going back now to watch the older episodes. I think that there's like a conventional wisdom, or maybe it was my mistake, but like some people feel like first season's a little bit more case of the week while the Boyd stuff's in the background, and then the second season is like the real Godfather season where it's like more, it's more of an overarching story. But I found that the balance in all the seasons between sometimes there are these singular storylines that get solved in a week or get wrapped up in that episode, but there's always this attention to an overarching story for the season to be maybe the most seamless, most brilliant execution of that.
I certainly think so.
That I've ever, no, but seriously, it is actually, it's so amazing to watch. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the chemistry behind coming up with the structure for these episodes and the structures for the seasons?
Well, one of the secret partners in this whole thing, not at all secret, is just simply FX. And we pitched it to 8 places, and we were fortunate enough that 6 were interested, and it really came down to FX and HBO. HBO is one of my favorite pitching stories because I was pitching my heart out, and it was like pitching to a wall. They were giving me nothing back, so I cut out all my jokes, all my shtick. We get out to the lobby, and Sarah and Michael say, "That's the best you've pitched it." It's like, well, fuck, I didn't do all of my funny stuff. And by the time we got to the elevators, they'd made an offer. But we went with FX because Michael and Sarah had worked with John Landgraf on a show called Karen Cisco, which was an attempt to do Elmore on network TV, and it was not a good fit. And we just knew that Landgraf and his team would be open to, and I just summed it up as a 4-minute scene between a couple of bad guys talking about chicken. In that you could just do those kind of Elmore things where you didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know if 2 people were going to become best friends or if one of them was going to shoot the other one. And there was always that tension. So they were critically important to the whole thing. And one of the 2 things that John Landgraf said from the start was, every episode has to have some kind of showdown. And for example, it could be Raylan versus the two guys in the dentist episode, out in the desert. It could be, but we also considered one in season 2 where it's Raylan and Loretta McCready, played by Caitlin Dever. Yes, we got to be working with Caitlin Dever when she was 12 years old. It went from 12 to by the end of the show, she was driving herself to the set. But there was one episode where Raylan's got to convince her to take a phone from him. That was the showdown. But every episode had to have some kind of showdown. And then the other thing was, he said, the first part of the season, let them all be episodic. Let them be just individual stories. You can start your thread of the overarching story of the season. But we had another thing, which is we didn't have Walton Goggins. He was supposed to die in the pilot. Everyone said, that's a bad idea. We agreed it was a bad idea. And so he was so excited to come back. Graham, I'm so excited, it's great. Unfortunately, I'm doing Predators in Hawaii with Robert Rodriguez, I think he was doing that one, I forget. And so he wasn't available while we were shooting. We got him for a weekend here, we could have him in a hospital bed, we could do that. But we knew he could really re-enter the story in the final third of the season. So that sort of dictated a lot of how that season played. And you'll notice that in subsequent seasons, let's say in the second season, the first four episodes or so have some kind of standalone aspect to them. In the third season, it's maybe 3. It just started to get smaller and smaller until by the end, it was fully serialized. And I think that was John planning for the life of the show, but also sort of seeing where television was going. That he sort of saw ahead that in 4 or 5 years, we can just do completely serialized storytelling.
Taylor, where did some of those standalone adventures come from? Were they all, were you guys doing sort of extracurricular research on U.S. Marshals cases, or where did some of those ideas come from?
They came from a lot of, for one thing, we had a really great, a guy named Charlie Almanza, who's a U.S. Marshal. He was our on-set consultant. And the guy was he's the most unassuming, quietest, and then he tells you these stories that just holy shit, that happened? Okay, well, we got to use that. So a lot of stuff came from Charlie. A lot of stuff came from just versions of our own screwed up pasts that we turned into TV, turned it into a little more television friendly stuff. But, for me, the standalone stuff was really fun. I really loved, because I had come from procedurals, I had done Reigns and Cold Case, and the notion, one of the great things Graham did for us on this show was breaking it out of anytime things started to feel hey, so what time did the man come in and the shot landed over here and the trail goes that way, we were just don't do that. We don't want to see it was sort of almost like an anti-procedural, and that's what drew me in so hard, was that kind of, that angle.
Yeah, Chris, often I realize when watching Justified, it's the sort of villains just reveal themselves out of stupidity a lot of the times. Was it fun to have such a rogues gallery of these rotating different bad guys coming in and out?
I mean, fun does not begin to describe how enjoyable it was as a writer to have good, solid, idiotic, deadly bad guys. Elmore's dictum was basically criminals are just assholes with guns. And we ran with that. I mean, we knew early on we wanted to create bad guys who were just as colorful and interesting and unpredictable as the people who you were ostensibly there to watch, the heroes. And so once we sort of landed on, okay, this is a bad guy worthy of an episode of our show, we knew we sort of had an episode, and we kind of could play with that. Personally, my favorite idiot bad guy was Dewey Crow, who I love to this day. I wish he were still with us so I could keep writing him in the spin-off series, Dewey Done It, or whatever it might be. But yes, I mean, I've long said to pretty much anyone who listened as a writer on this show, the gift, and Ingrid sort of touched on this, the gift is that you get to do anything. And you get to do everything you really would want to do as a writer. You get to do cops and robbers, which is fun. You get to do romance, straight drama. You get to do levity and comedy. And, you get to just play with all the colors in the palette. And no show that I've worked on has ever really had quite that combination. So it's not just the people involved, it's the way we approached it that really makes this a standout.
Well, and the bad guy stuff was so much fun to break and write because you really got to go do the most outlandish. And then at some point, after like 2 hours of being in stitches laughing at what these guys were going to do, somebody would be like, well, what's Raylan doing? And we'd be
The man
like,
in the hat.
"All right, shit, we gotta, he's gotta,
It's really
now that
quiet.
We've got this whole thing, we've gotta
you
like
have
go.
episodes where it's like, oh no, we left Raylan at the desk. Like,
We would have like 3 episodes where it was like, these bad guys are just out of their minds. This is going to be great. And then it was like, Raylan has to do something, doesn't he?
He's got to like get to him, but not get all the way there, and it's got to be a fun scene. And in the meantime, and how do you? It was just like, yeah, that strangely, as much as everybody loves Raylan, obviously, and he's the backbone of the show, we definitely could get caught up in the bad guy world a little bit.
Michael, I wanted to ask you, you worked on Karen Sisko, you worked so much on Justified. It's, it's pretty rare, but it's always pretty incredible when someone like gets Elmore Leonard on screen as a director. Are there any tricks to the trade that are shareable?
Well, as it's been said, it starts with the writing. And for a director doing this kind of material, for me, I mean, it's kind of in my sweet spot. And what I love about Elmore's stuff, we like to say that you don't see the joke coming, you don't see the violence coming. So it's very herky-jerky in terms of you're taking the audience by the neck, and saying, pay attention to this and surprising them. So I don't know if there's any trick. I mean, I think on this show, what appealed to me was, tonally, I felt it was in my sweet spot, but I grew up in Colorado, and the first movies I saw as a kid were Disney movies, and the first adult movies I saw were Westerns. Mm-hmm. And people always thought I came from New York and was a neurotic from New York, So if you'd said to me, do you want to do a postmodern Western, I would go, are you kidding me? And when Carl Beverly and I started talking about this material, the idea to kind of refocus what I grew up with was interesting to me because we were doing a postmodern noirish Western. And you'd walk just to the edge of the cliff in terms of the cliche and pull back. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, there's a moment in the pilot of Justified when he's going up against Dewey Crowe, and Raylan says, you don't knock without coming in, and Dewey says, well, I'm going to go outside, and then I'm coming back. And so the scene turns into like a duel outside this house, and Raylan's kind of framed as this heroic guy. The camera's a little low, and over it you see the house in the background, and this to me is what is the tone of Justified. He's sitting there, he's ready to draw, you think, and over his shoulder there's a satellite dish. So, I mean, I think that kind of summed it up. It was a postmodern kind of noirish Western with a tremendous sense of humor.
Yeah.
That scene is the reason why I wanted to do the show. And when they sent me the short story and I got to that, it was like, well, in most cop shows, the cop's going to be yelling, "Get down! Drop the gun!" Blah blah blah. And Raylan just stands there. "Can you rack a load before I put a hole in you?" It's like, I want to write that guy. And then the other thing was Dewey Crowe, one of the great gifts we had on the show, but it was Damon Harriman portraying him, because Damon would take stuff that we wrote that we knew was hilarious, and it was funny, and it was making us laugh, and he would play it dead straight, because that's what Dewey believed, and it made it even funnier.
Yeah.
And Patton Oswalt did that too. We hired Patton Oswalt, one of the funniest people in the world. We created Constable Bob just for him, because we heard he was a fan of the show. And he comes in, and he doesn't do anything funny. He just believes in Constable Bob, and then he's hilarious. And so we were gifted with these incredible performers. And
Well, and you remember where Constable Bob came from? When Harlan was we had been...
So the Harlan trips,
Yeah.
and the first Harlan trip goes back to Wendy, who had a friend, and that's how we met Squirrel, wasn't it, Wendy?
That's right.
You gotta hear about
You know
Squirrel.
you're doing a show set in Kentucky when we say, that's when we met Squirrel. And Squirrel was the marshal? No.
He was the
Yes,
chief,
Squirrel
he
was
was
a
the chief for
marshal
Eastern
in Lexington,
Kentucky.
I believe.
Yeah, something. Anyway, he said, "Oh, just call me Squirrel."
Well, that's where the idea of Mags first came from, by the way, as well. Just riding in the hollers of Harlan and hearing the stories of the real people and getting inspired.
And we would go back, a group would go back every year, and that's where Ingrid heard the story of, you went 5 times?
5 times.
You went
I
5.
love it. And there are people I still talk to back there. Oh yeah, Constable Bob was because I think Chris and I went, and I kept seeing this little dumpy car with a light bar on the top every now and then. And we were doing a ride along with Jeremy Lee, who is a state trooper, and I was like, "What is that car? I've seen it like 10 times." And Jeremy just looks at me. He's like, "Oh, Ingrid." He's like, "That would be Constable Bob." Well, I think it wasn't Bob, but it was like, "Oh, that'd be Constable Hank." And he tells me all about this guy, and it was Constable Bob. Like he would show up. I guess in Harlan they're elected, and basically the reason why people want the job is because you get paid to serve papers, essentially. But every now and then they would get someone who takes the job really seriously and who would show up on crime scenes, and that same thing, that he would show up at the bottom of the hill, and the troopers are like, "Oh, for the love of God, man." And they're like, "You got to stay down here." "No, I'm just here to help. I'm just here to help." And that was how Constable Bob was born, from hearing all these stories.
And his belt buckle knife was the real.
That was not the.
That was not
That was
Constable
Tony.
Hank. That was Tony, our.
Who did?
I don't know. He was like our handler.
Yes.
No. This was the guy in Harlan.
Yeah.
This is a guy. Yeah, he was one of our
He was
handlers.
showing us around, and he was the guy who had the go bag in his trunk.
Yep.
And he was the guy who had a buckle knife, and who showed Ingrid and I.
I was sitting
and
in
we
the
were
front
like,
seat.
"That's going in."
Back. And he literally did I was like, "Oh, what's with that knife?" And he said to me, "Pull on me." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "Pull on me." And so I was like, "Okay," and pretended to pull on him. And he pulled out his knife and went, like he was gonna, I was like, "I don't even know what," and we were like, "This is going in."
So Elmore Leonard was not far off in his description of crazy bad guys, even though Tony was a good guy.
Our second greatest review we got doing the life of the show was that people in Harlan got a kick out of it. Yeah. They thought it was funny, and like everyone everywhere, it's like, "Well, that's not me, but that is that guy. I know that guy." And it was so much fun to go there, and at the very end of the series, we took the final episode to Harlan and showed it to them in the gymnasium of the school that Raylan would have gone to in Everts. But anyway.
You know, one of the things I think that's really important is that there are all these great characters that we had, but the show was never condescending. You know, we never looked down on these characters, and we could be amused by. There was a lot of love for the biggest doofuses on the planet. You know, and I think that was really important to the storytelling and to, as you said, you know, people in Harlan loved the show because we embraced them. You know, part of the theme of the show was, if you were a carpetbagger who came into Kentucky, do so at your own, you know, you beware.
Yeah. Dave, I was wondering, you know, there's this idea in sports where you're supposed to like design your offense to get the most out of playmakers, and then, but when you have the actors that you're all writing for on this show, how much did you notice yourselves writing for Walt, writing for Noel, writing for Tim, because they were showing you different shades of the characters than maybe you had thought about previously?
Yeah, I mean, and look, the reality is we can take it so far, and then they have to make it their own. And there's this wonderful kind of synergy that happens in the beginning, especially, right? Is you're pretty sure what you're building for them on the page, but then they're going to take it and they're going to make it this whole other thing. And look, Dewey Crowe is a great example. Like finding Damon and finding somebody who could take that character, as outlandish as he was, and ground it. You're like, oh, well, we got to write more. You know, you got to write for Dewey Crowe, and you write to their strengths as best you think you know them. And the actors inevitably come back and they've got their thoughts, and you hopefully incorporate those. And yeah, I mean, like Dewey Crowe died on the page a few times before he met his unfortunate end in the show, and it got kicked back to us by FX, I believe twice, where they were like, "Are you sure? Are you sure that this is really where you want to take Dewey Crowe out of your, you know, off the page for you guys?" And they were absolutely right. It would have been a huge mistake, and he got the death. Spoiler alert, sorry. He got the death he deserved, and it really helped us in the show. I mean, it was the moment where you were like, "Oh, fuck Boyd Crowder.
Yeah.
Fuck that guy," you know, and it was important, and it was vital, and there's a really good lesson, I think, in that as well.
And that audience antipathy towards Boyd lasted a good 30, 40 seconds. Because people loved him so much, they're like, "No, he shot Dewey Crowe." Oh, Boyd.
BJ, I saw you kind of like point a little bit. Is it easier when you can do a little bit of a reset button on a character like Boyd because there is going to be the natural charisma of Goggins?
Well, I think I was reacting to what Graham was saying because I think that a lot of us, me included, underestimated how much people loved Boyd and would forgive him for anything, and so I think we tried in the final season to remind people that, well, this guy is a murderer, and he kills people for no good reason sometimes, but then he hasn't gotten his swastika tattoos removed for some reason, right? But at the end of the day, I remember being at the rap party for the final season, and I remember one of the other actors, I can't remember, one of the guys who played one of Boyd's thugs, came up to me and was like, yeah, I like how y'all tried to turn Boyd into a bad guy at the end. And I was like, in the first episode, he shot the dude for no reason, Anyway.
I'm going to do something where I'm going to put you all on the spot a little bit, and we can start with Wendy, but I was wondering whether you would mind mentioning a moment, and it can either be a moment that you wrote that you're particularly proud of, or a scene that you were a part of that you were particularly proud of, or one that you were particularly jealous of from the show.
Yeah. In an episode I wrote in the second season, there is a moment where our marshals are faced with not shooting a character of color, and that was before Trayvon Martin.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of that.
And in that episode, Fucked Up and Funny, we had this magician named Flex, played by Chadwick Boseman. And we were told by another secret sauce in this whole show in the casting was Cammie Patton, who was our casting director. And she said, so Chadwick Boseman is about to explode into movies and do all this stuff, but he's free to play this part. I think you should get him. It's like, okay, Cammie, let's get him. The other Wendy moment that I have to talk about, because it was Elmore Leonard's favorite scene in the whole series, and it's a scene at the courthouse when Ava has been abducted or she's under threat, and there's a scene between Ava and Winona.
Yeah.
And they sit down and they talk, so it fails the Bechdel test entirely because they're talking about Raylan. But what he loved was that there was no animosity between them. They were just two people sitting having this conversation. And he said, man, I love that scene.
That's so wonderful. Thanks for saying that. I mean, I'll be honest, one last thing that, and I don't know if it's proud of, but just I felt like was a leap off for me personally in my career, was the opportunity to write such a badass and come up with ideas and share ideas with them about the character of Mags.
Yeah.
Really led me to wanting to do Revenge, wanting to do Nashville, wanting to do like just as many badass female characters as I could dig into. I was spoiled rotten after that season and just couldn't get enough of that, so for sure.
BJ, what about you?
Well, I also want to say real quickly that it was Wendy's idea to have Wynn Duffy in an RV. I remember that pitch in the room. But for me, my favorite moment, the favorite thing I wrote, carries not even an ounce of the weight of Wendy's. But I have to be honest that I was always, some of the fun of like writing for me is trying to put fun little in-jokes in, like for people, and like being from Dallas, I'm a big P1 at The Ticket, which is a sports radio station there. And so that line that Dewey Crow says, "The anus is on you," that was an actual mistake someone made on the air on The Ticket. And so when I got a chance to write a scene in one of Chris's episodes, because we were in a hurry, I was like, Dewey Crow is the only person on TV who could really say that. And it stuck. Chris kept it, and I think that was my favorite moment.
Why can't we have Dewey do a college football podcast, man? Like, what are we missing in this country? Ingrid, what about you?
I can't say the thing I was jealous of was coming on season 3 was not getting to work with Margot Martindale, but I did get to work with her on Sneaky Pete, actually, which was I was so happy that I finally got to work with Margot, who I absolutely adored. But I will say my favorite moment that I wrote was Boyd proposing to Ava. I flat out cried when I wrote that scene. And I remember Walton actually came up and he just loved it and said it was one of his favorite moments in the series ever. And I think he also said he like framed the pages or something, which I don't necessarily think is true. But he gushed about it, and watching them shoot that just was fantastic.
And that's from the woman who was there the day that Jake Busey blew up.
Yes.
And covered Boyd and Win
Oh,
Duffy
yes.
in little bits of himself.
That was good. That was good.
Ben, what about you?
There are a lot. I mean, it's really a good show. But no, the thing that stands out, maybe because Ingrid just mentioned Margot, is there's a scene between Margot and Caitlin, and I guess in episode 2 of season 2, and we didn't yet know just how good Caitlin was and was going to be. Obviously, we knew that Margot was a powerhouse, but it's this scene in that episode where, you know, essentially Margot is sort of de facto adopting her. I mean, she's murdered her father in the previous episode. We know that, but Loretta doesn't. And it's this sort of seduction scene of Margot walking her around, and you're worried that she's going to give her the apple pie, which she gave to her father, and that it's going to be poisoned. And the two of them are just so brilliant and sort of, just so wonderful together in that scene. It just crackles. I remember being on set like, this is just high level.
That's so cool. Chris, what about you?
Couple things. I'll start with something I was jealous of. So I think in the second season, we had, as Graham said, and as we talked about, we weren't quite fully serialized yet, and we were still, in some ways, finding the show. And I remember early on pitching the thing about the watch coming from Loretta's father. And if we planted that, maybe we could pay it off, and it could be this thing, and it would set into motion all this chaos. And I remember feeling very kind of proprietary about when we pay it off, and we could do this, and we could do that. And I didn't end up getting to write the episode, and I was like, oh man, this was such a juicy, I really felt like this one. And then Taylor wrote it, and I'm honestly, I don't think I'd ever read anything quite as good, and so much beyond what I could have done with the same material. And it was one of those moments where I was like, Jesus, this is a good room. I mean, like, if we can take the raw material that we all feel an affinity for, proprietary, there's that. The other thing I want to say is that I guess I'm proud of this, but I'm more grateful for this. Graham, throughout the run of the show, was more generous about the writing than any person I've ever worked for, really, or with. There were, innumerable instances where we would write a draft, we would get notes, and pretty much from then on, Graham would say, all right, you take it. You deal with it. You figure it all out. And so many things that I wrote, being neurotic and a writer, I was like, I think it works, I don't know, would go on screen. And feeling like, wow, that was unmediated, it lives or dies with me behind it, was a tremendous feeling. And there's many, many moments that went to camera unadulterated. One that comes to mind that I'll wrap up being proud of is, I think it was late in the 6th season, there was a moment where we were again trying to make Boyd, trying to remind people like he's a rotten, rotten bastard. We have to root for him, to pay the price. And Shea Wiggum came in to do a kind of an uncharacteristic scene for us. It was a pretty heavy scene where he sort of talks about, oh, okay, I know I'm going to die, but I'm okay with that. I'm not frightened of you, Boyd. And he sort of was ready to meet the maker and all that stuff. And Shea, who I didn't know, who only came in for a day, came over to me. He's like, this is heavy stuff, man. This is good. And I was like, geez, thanks, guy who's not on the show, who doesn't need to be nice, So I was very proud of, an actor who had really no stake in telling me that it was a great little scene doing so.
Dave?
Can I quickly jump in? Because it's a Chris thing, which is final season. Arlo hadn't been on the show since season 4. He died in season 4, didn't he? Because he was hiding the secret of who really was Sheriff Who's a Biscuit, whatever that was. Troy Donahue, Drew Thompson.
B.J. Novak, D.B. Sweeney, somebody like that. He was supposed
to. We hadn't seen Arlo, and Chris didn't tell us. And he wrote a scene where Raylan sees Arlo's ghost and has a conversation with him. He just went for it. And I was so happy that he did, but I was also like, I'm so happy that we've got a room where that's okay. And you can try that shit, because if I didn't like it, I'd just put a line through it.
I mean, you fired him.
That's what I
right
figured.
after. Yeah.
Fire him.
I was either going to be, it's like, well, it was nice working with
Yeah,
you.
but you got that close to the end. It was sad not to go all the way. I did fire him for just not clearing it with me, but it was still a
You
great
fired
scene.
all of us multiple times, Graham. You fired us all multiple times over the season.
And every time you all
Most fired
deserved it.
staff
Yeah,
ever.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd still show up.
Dave.
Yeah, look, I guess selfishly, I'll just go back to the first episode I'd written of it, because as Graham said, I was on another show, and I came into the room, and Graham had given me my first job on Reigns years before, and so I'd come in when that other show got canceled, and they were already breaking the episode I ended up writing, so I was only in the room for a few days, and I was kind of cramming and reading the scripts. I had read the pilot because Graham had written it, and I wanted to read it, once before. But then I kind of got handed an episode, and I was still trying to figure out the tone of the show, and I guess they were a little bit too. And I didn't have a whole lot of time. I went off and you shut yourself away for 4 or 5 days or whatever, and wrote it, and you turn it in, and there's that moment when you turn it in where you're like, oh shit, like is this does this work? Is this even the right thing? And getting that call from Graham, from the guy who'd given me my first job, where he said it's unbelievable. Right. No, it wasn't. It was shit. But he was really sweet about being like, it's unbelievable. Look, I have one note. There's only one L in Marshall. But other than that, it was a pretty cool thing to be like, oh, okay, I get this. I can do this. I did him proud. And then, over the next 6 years, I think the great joy was getting scripts from these guys without sitting up here. I know we're all having this self-congratulatory moment, but to get scripts from these writers and open them and just be like flipping pages, and you just sit there and you're like, fuck. I wish I was as good as these people. And I always kind of secretly loved the way Taylor wrote the show. And I do think that episode, Brother's Keeper, in the second season, for me, is the high watermark of the show. So many things kind of converged and went right. And Taylor was absolutely the guy to write it. And it was really very cool to get to be a part of that and push yourself and try to be better, to measure up.
Taylor, you're just like, I agree.
Jeez. No, that was, I came in season 2. These guys had already, there was such a rhythm to this room when I came in, and I was coming from a different kind of room, frankly, where the kind of rooms I were in were breaking the details of where this thing went vis-a-vis, Act 1. And I came in this room, it was just like anarchy. It was just like, let's do this. Well, we got a karate bob, and all these characters are floating around. I was just like, okay. So, I mean, I tried to swim as best I could, and it happened to be a really good environment, really buoyant water to swim in. But the thing that I mostly remember was later in the show, it was season 4, I think, and it was Chris and Graham wrote a script that I can't remember the name of now, but it was it was the coal train where they're trying to get out, where they're trying to sneak the sheriff out of the town. It was very complicated to get there. It was like it was 11 of 13, and these guys just wrote this Swiss watch that just got tighter and tighter and tighter every time I read it. And by the time I got, what do we have? Who was playing? It wasn't Garrett Dillahunt. He was playing a bad guy. The one who said, when you cast me, I would like Gerard Depardieu to play me. It was just great. But that episode was one of the ones that I just watched and went, oh my God, I am a part of something that is so much cooler than I even realized I could be a part of. It was just a next level episode, and that's one that I remember. I watch again and again. It's just a great episode.
Michael, what about you?
Well, there are two things that look, I could talk about a lot of episodes, or I could call Walter Mosley and he'd tell me what was great. But there are two things that I remember. One was the final episode of this second season and talking about Caitlin, and we had to pull that scene up early where she has to put her gun down and she's talked down by Raylan. And we had to pull it up like a day or two early. We didn't get to rehearse it. She was a young actress, and she did it in 2 takes, and she had this monologue. And I remember off camera was the great Margot Martindale, and I would look at Margot and she would go, and I would look back and go, and I'd look at the camera operators who were in tears. So, and I remember somebody came up to us at the Emmys that year and said, how did you get that performance out of Caitlin? And I said, well, for me, I just got out of the way. I mean, she was just brilliant. But the other thing I do want to talk about, I mean, we talk about how Boyd gave the, gave the series, its longevity, but also I think the reason why this show worked, I want to talk about you, which is in the first, there was a lot of Elmore in the first script, because we loved Elmore, but there was a lot of you in the first script. And there's a moment where Raylan breaks in to his ex-wife's house, and he tells a story about chasing down a guy to Nicaragua. And he says, I never thought of myself as an angry man. And she says, well, Raylan, you're the angriest man I've ever met. And I think it was that setup of a character who's a flawed protagonist that drove this series for 6 years and now into this limited series that we're doing. And I think that it's, that's because of you.
Thank you. And that was a challenge from FX. And they said, we need something else at the end of the season. And honestly, I can't, like the best stuff we all know, I have no idea where it came from. But I just did think that if he's so cool and calm, maybe there's something else going on. And it did turn out to be our engine for the whole thing. And also just the simple question of, would I shoot it on our man? So we knew when we were getting into the final season, and by the way, it was relative anarchy in that we didn't know exactly how it was going to end up. We thought maybe this person would live, this person would die, all of that. And finally we came up, and this was a couple years after Elmore died, and it was like, oh right, let's end it the way he would have ended it, which is he didn't kill off a lot of bad guys unless they really were awful. And so, okay, so Boyd can live. Well, we're not going to kill Raylan. We're not that kind of show. Okay. And what about Ava? It's like, well, Elmore loves it when the woman gets away with the money and beats these guys. I mean, that was part of his sweet spot. So we figured that out. But the big thing was that Raylan has a chance to shoot Boyd in the barn, and we built the whole season of Boyd doing one horrible thing after another. If anyone deserves to be shot at that time, it's Boyd, and he doesn't. But then we knew we had to have a showdown because we're justified. So we had spent half the season building up our character of Boone, and we, the casting gods. We got Mary Steenburgen, we got Sam Elliott, and we got our dear friend. Why am I blanking on his name?
Jonathan Tucker.
Who just stepped into that thing, and it was like, oh, we're safe. And so much of the time you're doing something like this, you don't know how it's going to go. Even when we cast Margot, she was great. And I remember Adam Arkin directed that first episode of the second season. And we were all down in the writer's room, and the editing was upstairs. And he said, Sarah, Fred, Graham, I want to show you something. And he took us upstairs, and he showed us the poisoning scene. And there was that sense of, we've got a season. Yeah. He also showed us the scene of Caitlin as Loretta outwitting the pervert, the pedophile in the drying shed. It's like, wow, okay, because we thought if that actor doesn't work out, we'll have her disappear, run away, and appear at the very end and just do something. And it was like, no, we got to write to her. So many people, and I would say the reason the show worked is, and the reason there are people here, is because everyone was pulling in the same direction. John Harrington, our props man, built a working still for the big party at Mag's. Now, it only made that much liquor, which, for the Justified writer staff, not nearly enough. They were drinking moonshine out of a KFC bag in Harlan when we went down there at the very end. That classy. And that's it.
I would love to be able to give the audience a chance to ask some questions here. Do we need to do microphone, or is that okay? Okay, great. So yellow shirt right there.
I'll take a run at it. I mean, we made up a lot of stuff as we went along, and a lot of it was just sort of a gut feeling. I don't think Art did end up shooting Wynn Duffy. Yeah, he. By the way, let Chris Provenzano wrote that scene. Chris, why don't you handle this question? No. The larger question that I think is behind that is, would we do the same show now that we did then? And all of law enforcement and shootings and everything. And I have no real answer to that. I know that we were trying to do an Elmore Leonard show, and we weren't trying to do truly a real show about real people in a real world. We always sort of said that our show was real but 1 foot off the ground. And it exists in that sort of slightly fantasy world. That's not an excuse. That's just a dodge. No. One thing is, we did talk about the fact that there's a scene. What was the scene with Lindsay the bartender? What episode? That was season 3, and the gun goes off, and then in the later episode you see the bullet hole in the floor. That we always wanted to say that the bullets ended up somewhere. People don't just fire them off and away they go. It's real people get hurt, and there are real consequences. The reality is, Raylan wouldn't have been a marshal for long. With the Marshal Service and their codes of conduct and stuff like that, he would have been out early in season 1. That's just the reality. And by the way, unofficially, the Marshals love the show. And we did work some funny stories in that they had, including the guy throwing his artificial leg out the window and then following it. That was a story that Charlie told. So it's. I don't think we'd do the same show. But I don't know exactly how we would do it. I do know that you'll see in this new limited series, there is much more of a reckoning for Raylan Givens. That the 8 episodes, without giving anything, am I giving too much away? But I mean, it's
no. Look, that was a big part of the discussion on if we're going to do this thing. This is not a it's not a victory lap, right? If we're going to do it, why are we going to do it? Who is Raylan now? What has happened in the last 10 years? I would argue the world isn't so much different as it is people are just more aware of what's been happening for a long time with law enforcement. But it is now on the forefront of everyone's mind the way it was not 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And part of the discussion of are we going to do this was, can we, look, it's still got to be justified, right? It's still got to be Elmore Leonard. It's still going to be assholes with revolvers. But is there something to say, and is there a way to bring it into 2022? And we all kind of spent a bunch of time banging our heads against the wall, and we thought that there was. So, like everyone else, you evolve and you learn and you adjust accordingly.
I think we have time for one more. I'm sorry, right here.
so. That was you?
Well, no, he wasn't my brainchild. I just inherited.
Yeah.
I inherited all the Dickie Bennett.
Didn't we
Wasn't
know?
it Mario
family?
Puzo's?
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of. Wasn't it Fredo, honestly?
Well,
Yeah, we
actually,
definitely-
Fredo a little bit, Mario Puzo. It was, but it was really so. Elmore is sitting at Video Village in season 1, and Tim leans over to him and says, "Why don't you write another Raylan story?" And Elmore said, "Yeah, sure." So he went off and he wrote a story, and he had so much fun he wrote another 2 stories, and that became his last book. That's his 45th book. And it's dedicated to me and Tim. So that's the best thing that's ever happened to me in this business. But in his story, it was more crows. Man, he loved the crows. And that's why in season 5, it was after he died, we had the crows in Florida coming up to infest the crows in Kentucky. And at any rate, it was Purvis Crow and his 2 kids, and I think one was Dickie. It was Dickie and Coover. And then we decided to add Doyle, who would be a cop. And then we changed it all, did a gender swap and made it the Bennetts. And that's where Dickie started, but it was Jeremy wanted to be on the show. Take it over.
Yeah, Jeremy. It was just like more and more and more. And there's just nothing you could do to Jeremy that wasn't like, yeah, put my head in a bag and just I don't want to have to breathe. It's cool. Just whatever, man. I just make it hurt. And he just was that kind of actor. So we're like, all right, let's put a bag on his head. And he was one of those guys who just, as Fredo, as we were kind of looking at him a little bit, the more we kept giving him, the more he would double down on it, and the more he doubled down, the more like, all right, well, so it became this sort of vicious cycle of abuse for both Jeremy and Dickie Bennett.
Fortunately, we have to wrap up there, but I just want to thank everybody for coming out today, and I want to thank this amazing group of people for making such a wonderful show. Thanks.